Hello, hello, hello. It is Dr. Mandik. Welcome back to Introduction to Philosophy. We're starting another unit. This is our unit about free will, and we're going to be talking a lot about something called determinism in philosophy. The big question about free will has to do with its relationship to determinism. There's some people that say determinism is true, everything is determined, and therefore no one has any free will. There's other people that say, no, don't worry about it. Things aren't all predetermined. So therefore you have free will. And there's yet other people that say, you know what? Yeah, even if things are predetermined, you could still have free will. So you might be wondering, who cares? Why does it matter? We'll talk about that also. We're free to do so. We're free to talk about that. Or maybe we were determined to talk about that. This picture that you're looking at is actually very important for thinking about what this is all about. So a lot of you will recognize some of the main things going on in this picture. There's some dominoes, and one of them has already been pushed over. And what caused it? Causation is an important part of this discussion. What caused the domino to fall over? Well, something that happened a little bit earlier in time. Time is something that we talk a lot about in this class. Something that happened a little bit earlier in time caused that domino to fall over, and you have a sense of what's going to happen in the future. A little bit in the future, this next domino is going to fall over, and the next one's going to fall over. But going backward in time, well, what caused this to fall over must have been something to do with the finger. The finger pushed it, the finger knocked it over. And so we see that not only is there a finger, but there's a hand and an arm, and it's somehow connected to a brain. But there's an interesting thing that happens in the picture, is that a lot of what's going on in the picture is a machine. Machines are all about cause and effect and things determined by other things. This gear turns and makes this other gear turn. This lever gets pulled and makes this pulley go up. And the machine is also the person. And you might say that makes sense, because maybe what a person is just a meat machine. The brain is just a machine like anything else in the physical universe. The brain is made out of electrons and neutrons and protons, and they're just following the laws of physics like any old machine. So you might as well talk about nerves connecting the hand to the brain, or you talk about wires. Philosophically, it's all the same thing. We've got a sequence of cause and effect leading from the dominoes to the hand, to the muscles, to the brain, to what? What caused the brain to do what it was going to do? Well, you might say you could trace it all the way back to events that happened in the environment, events that happened in the genes and the cells of the person, events that happened prior to the person being born. Things that were set forth all the way back at the Big Bang determined that this person's brain was going to make this person's arm hit this domino, which is determined to make the next domino fall, and so on and so forth. And you might wonder, where in this picture is there room for free will? And a lot of people are going to say, nowhere. Nowhere at all. You might say, okay, fine, whatever. But wait a minute, maybe that's bad news. Maybe there's all sorts of things that are really important, and they importantly depend on there being such a thing as free will. One of the sorts of things that we're going to be talking a lot about besides free will and determinism is moral responsibility. One of the main things that makes philosophers think that they've got to settle this stuff about free will is that the concept of moral responsibility depends on it. You might say, like, well, who cares about moral responsibility? Well, a lot of people care about moral responsibility. People that are in jail or being threatened to get thrown in jail care about whether they were actually morally responsible for the thing that they've been accused of. But other things have to do with moral responsibility too. So if you are rewarded or paid for something, it's because you're responsible for that thing. You are the one that wrote that movie script, and that's why you and not somebody else is getting the Oscar. So you're responsible. If you weren't responsible, why are we giving you an award for it? So not just punishment, but also rewards are connected with moral responsibility. You are the one that made this happen in a special sense that's a moral sense, and that's why it is just to either reward or punish you for it. And this applies not just to criminal law, but just basic everyday interactions like, do I have to pay you money if I want to get that candy bar? One of the things you should be thinking about throughout this whole unit is, what do you believe? Do you believe in free will? Do you believe that free will exists? Do you think that you are free? A lot of people think that freedom is really important, and some people say that it's worth dying for, that people have died in wars to protect our freedom. So some people think it's pretty important. Are you one of those people? Do you think that freedom is important? Or do you think that there's just really no such thing? It's a myth. It's an illusion. One of the things that we're going to talk a little bit later in this video is about how some scientists claim that they have scientific experiments to show that free will is actually just an illusion. And remember, we've talked about illusions before in our lecture about realism and idealism, and there was the argument from illusion, and most of those illusions were like perceptual illusions, especially visual illusions, where things that were one color actually looked a different color, or things that were one shape looked at like they were a different shape. But there's all sorts of illusions, and maybe free will itself is one of the illusions, that the human brain systematically produces an illusion that we're free. In reality, we're not free. Let's talk a little bit more about the relationship between, on the one hand, free will, and on the other hand, moral responsibility. So here's some stories, two stories that are supposed to help us understand what philosophers think the connection is between moral responsibility and free will is supposed to be. So we've got two stories, each of which involve a driver. One of the drivers is named Steve. Let's call this guy here Steve, and this other driver is Danny. And in both stories, I think you can sense that something bad is going to happen to the little kids that are hanging out right in front of the moving vehicles. Sorry about that. But let's talk more about Steve. Steve is, pretty good guy. He's had a pretty good life. Nothing really bad has ever happened to Steve before. Very healthy person. He has been to the doctor recently, and the doctor said, "Yeah, you're in wonderful health. You're in fine health. Don't have any reason to think that there's anything wrong with you." And Steve says, "Well, that's great, because my family has just got a history of great health. No weird, strange medical issues has ever afflicted Steve. But nonetheless, doctors can't catch everything. Sometimes there's things that go wrong, and just completely unexpectedly, while Steve is driving, he has a stroke, and he can't help it. There's a blood vessel that breaks inside of his brain, and it disturbs a big region of his brain, and he swerves in traffic, and his car goes up on the sidewalk, and it's very tragic. But there's this little girl that his car plows into, and she dies." So that's the story of Steve. The ST in Steve should remind you of the ST in the word stroke. Steve had a stroke, and something bad happened. Something happened inside of Steve's brain, and that caused this little girl to die. Next story, Danny. Danny. Danny's had a different sort of life from Steve. Danny, he's been to the doctor, and he's been to a bunch of doctors, and he was diagnosed with an obstructive sleep apnea because he had a problem of falling asleep behind the wheel. He had a problem of falling asleep at work, and the doctor said, "Yeah, you've got the sleep disorder," and they started treating his sleep disorder, but he was told that he should not drive his car when he feels sleepy, and they also told him he should never, ever, ever drive his car if he's had any alcohol to drink. Any alcohol, not just, like a lot of alcohol, but no alcohol. Because of his sleep disorder, he's especially prone to falling asleep behind the wheel, especially if he's had anything to drink. Well, Danny was at a party, and there was some alcohol, and he drank some of the alcohol, and he didn't just drink a little bit of alcohol. Within 1 hour, he drank 5 alcoholic beverages, and most people know that that's way too much alcohol to be drinking, especially if you're going to be jumping behind the wheel and operating a vehicle, on top of already knowing that you have this sleep disorder that will increase the likelihood of you falling asleep while driving. Several of his friends try to talk him out of leaving the party, and driving, and he gets very belligerent and he runs off and he gets in his car and he's like, you know what, you're not the boss of me. I'm going to drive my car anyway. So he gets in his car, even though has been drinking. Arguably, he is drunk. He gets in his car and he's driving and not doing a great job anyway. But then he also falls asleep behind the wheel, and oh no, the steering wheel turns in the wrong way, and his car jumps up the curb, and he runs over this kid that's playing, and the kid dies. So Danny, D for Danny, D for drunk. Something happened in Danny's brain. That's where alcohol goes. It goes all over, but it goes in your brain. And something happened in his brain, and it caused this kid to die. You might say it's just like Steve, and you might say there's really no difference in the stories here. You've got two creatures that have brains, and they operate vehicles, and just one day something happened in the brains that caused the vehicles to jump the curb and kill a small child. Exactly the same story. Other people are going to say, no. Steve is the victim of just a tragic set of circumstances. He is innocent. He can't be blamed for the death of this child. I bet he feels awful anyway, but no one would say, you know what, we should beat the crap out of Steve, or we should throw him in jail, or we should take his driver's license away, or something like that. No one's going to say, what a jerk. Steve had no inkling that he was going to have a stroke. He had been to the doctor. He knew his family history. There's no history of any ill health. The doctor said he was in fine health. Danny, on the other hand, he knew, everyone knows you shouldn't drink 5 beers an hour and then jump in a car. And on top of that, he'd been told by his doctor that he shouldn't drive if he's had any alcohol at all because of his sleep disorder. But he did it anyway, even though he knew better, and something happened in his brain, and that caused the kid to die. But Danny is morally responsible for what he did. One way we might put this stuff about moral responsibility is in terms of free will. The death of this child was not the result of Steve's free will. He didn't do anything of his free will that resulted in the kid's death. But Danny did something of his free will that resulted in this kid's death. And that is he jumped in the car despite having those alcoholic beverages, or even that he drank those beverages in the first place. That happened of his free will, and that resulted in the death of this kid. Steve may have done all sorts of things of his free will, but none of them were things that resulted in the death of this kid. Just driving a car, we don't blame people for driving cars, and we wouldn't blame him for having the stroke. That's just a thing that happened to him. Having the stroke is not something that he did. Danny, well, he fell asleep. Why did he fall asleep? Because of something that he chose to do, which is to drive the car and or drink those beverages. So hopefully that, even if you don't agree with this, you can kind of see what the point is. That there's a very big temptation in the minds of a lot of people to say that free will is very important, and what is important about it is the way that it helps us decide or state who is morally responsible for what. Danny is morally responsible for the death of that kid down here in a way that Steve is not morally responsible for the death of this kid. And the difference that makes a difference has to do with, what did they do of their free will? Did they do anything of their free will which they would have been able to know ahead of time would lead to bad consequences? And we're going to talk about determinism, and we're going to talk about the different kinds of determinism. There's a lot of different kinds of determinism that we're going to talk about. Some of them are more important than others, but they're all kind of cool and interesting. So here we go. Here are the kinds of determinism that we're going to discuss. We've got something called theological determinism, and hopefully you recognize theological means stuff to do with God and religion, stuff that we were talking about in the previous unit. Something called physical determinism, and then there's ethical determinism, psychological determinism, and logical determinism. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 kinds of determinism. Like I said, some are more important than others, and I would say that the most important for thinking about free will are physical determinism and psychological determinism. But let's start with theological determinism. Theological determinism probably was like way more important a few hundred years ago when society was much more religious. Things have become a lot more secular, and because of that, in philosophical discussions, you don't see as much of an emphasis on theological matters, but that doesn't mean that it's gone away or it's not important anymore. But let's think about theological determinism. Theological determinism holds that every event is determined, or we might also say predetermined, by God's perfect foreknowledge. So if you think back to the definitions of God from, what lecture was that? That would have been lecture 16. We were talking about the different definitions of God. One of the definitions of God was the definition that used all the omni words. God was the omnibenevolent, omnipotent, omniscient creator of the universe. And omniscient is the one that's the most important for theological determinism. God is omniscient. God knows everything. Now, if you take that literally, like God knows everything, then, that means that every truth is known by God to be true. So, let's take stuff about the future. That's a truth, right? I mean, isn't there a truth about, like, what are you going to do tomorrow? And if so, then God knows it. Or we might put it like this. God always has been and always will be omniscient. God is also, by definition, the creator of the universe. So that means way back when he was creating the universe, he knew everything. Well, isn't the future a thing? Doesn't he know what happens in the future? And right? So, like, here's the thing that back during the creation would have been in God's future. And that is, I decided to wear a gray shirt on... I'm recording this on November 1st, 2018. I decided this morning to put on a gray shirt. It's got buttons. It's actually got long sleeves. You can see my sleeves. I decided to put on this shirt this morning. Well, way back at the beginning of time, that was the future. Didn't God know back then that I was going to put on this shirt? You might say, no, he didn't know that. Well, if he didn't know that, then that's a thing he didn't know. And if there is at least one thing that he doesn't know, then he doesn't know everything. And if he doesn't know everything, then he's not omniscient. However, by definition, he is omniscient. One thing that's worth emphasizing, and you might lose points on the quiz if you don't pay attention to this right now. The point of theological determinism is not that God is making things happen by causing them to happen. The point is not that God is creating the future. The point is not that he is a puppet master. The point is, instead, that he knows everything. Since he knows everything, he has to have known it ahead of time. But in order for him to know it ahead of time, it had to be set. It had to be set ahead of time. So it's not like God is causing me to wear the gray shirt. It's just that he knows ahead of time that I'm going to wear the gray shirt. But that's enough. That's enough to make it logically true that the past determines the future. It's not that the past is causing the future. It's something besides causation. It is, you might call it, logical, or more accurately, epistemological. Okay, let's talk about physical determinism. In some sense, this is easier to understand, and another thing we might say about this is the most important kind of determinism for understanding what the free will issue is all about. Physical determinism has to do with physics and has to do with, like, the laws of nature. And there's this idea that every event that is caused to happen is caused to happen by some prior event. And further, the causation is always in accordance with the laws of nature. Now think about what it means for something to be a law of nature. By the way, this is something that we discussed back in lecture 15? Nope, sorry, lecture 19. When we were talking about miracles and the supernatural, we talked about what a law was. A law is a regularity, something that usually happens. We might say always happens. So, can't break the laws of nature. You can't. Like what goes up must come down, and you might say, well, that's not true. Like some things levitate, some things fly, but it's only because of some other law of nature that allows them to do that. You don't ever break the laws of gravity. Airplanes don't break the laws of gravity. Airplanes fly because of other physical laws that allow them to fly. And if it wasn't for the wings and Bernoulli's principle that has to do with the differentials of air pressure in the wind flowing over the curvature of the top of the wing and under the different curvature of the bottom of the wing, if it wasn't for that law being in effect because of the structure of the wing, then the airplane would plummet to the earth. There is no breaking the laws of physics. And what are you, really? And this brings us to unit... the metaphysics unit, lecture 14, we talked about persons, we talked about parts, things that are made out of parts. We might say, you know what you are? You're just a pile of parts. You are made out of cells, which are made out of atoms, which are just physical things that obey the laws of physics. Everything that happens inside of your body and outside of your body is just this completely law-governed, deterministic system. These little particles that are attracted to each other because of their electrical charges or repelled by one another because of different electrical charges, different kinds of particle forces like weak nuclear force, strong nuclear force, electromagnetic force, gravitational force are determining all the motions of all these particles, and you are just a big pile of particles. So everything that happens is determined to happen by some prior event because everything that happens is caused to happen in accordance with the laws of physics. So in theological determinism, we're not talking about causation. We're talking about a different kind of determinism, but it's determinism nonetheless. Here, in physical determinism, we are talking about causation. We're saying that previous events are determining later events causally. The one thing is causing the other thing to happen. Here's yet another kind of determinism, and this is a lot more like theological determinism than physical determinism, logical determinism. And this is something that we've talked a bit about back when we were talking about time and the structure of time and whether the future was real. It's also something that we talked about in connection with the correspondence theory of truth. Either there is going to be a sea battle tomorrow or there isn't going to be a sea battle tomorrow. That either or statement has to be true. It has to be true. Now, it has to be true now. Because it's meaningful now. It's a meaningful statement now, and all meaningful statements have to either be true or false. So it's either true now or it's false now. The statement P, where P stands for proposition, you can plug any proposition in there. Let the proposition be there's a sea battle tomorrow. So either there's a sea battle tomorrow or there's not a sea battle tomorrow. It can't be both and it can't be neither. It's got to be one or the other. And if it's one, it's got to be true now that it's that one. And if it's the other, then it's got to be true now that it's the other. So whatever happens tomorrow, there's already a true statement today about it. And given that the statement is true today, then when tomorrow rolls around, it has to conform to what's happening today. Now, one thing that's worth emphasizing is that logical determinism is not about knowledge. It's about truth. Theological determinism is about knowledge, and it's about God's knowledge. Logical determinism, no one has to know what the future is. We're not assuming that we know what the future is. We're just saying that whatever the future is, there's already a statement now that's true about the future. So therefore, when the future comes along, it has to conform to that previously true statement. Oh, man. Crazy stuff. Okay, here's something that's way more relevant to other stuff we're going to be talking about. Psychological determinism. And you might remember that we talked about this way at the beginning of this semester, but we're going to talk about it again. And it's this idea that everything that you do, and I don't mean things that happen to you, but I mean things that you do. So like I scratch my beard. That's something that I do. I get kind of sweaty when the room gets hot. That's something that happens to me. I'm talking about things I do. My heart rate goes up if you like make a loud noise. That's something that happens to me. But like sometimes I take my glasses off. That's something I do. Sometimes I decide to drink a bunch of beer and get in a car. That's something I do. But if I have a stroke, that's something that happens to me. Everything that you do, things that are your actions, they are always caused by your desires. Which desires? Well, the ones that are your greatest desires at that time. That's what it means to do something as opposed to have it merely happen to you. A rock on a hill gets hit by a tree which was struck by lightning, and the rock rolls down the hill. Now, did the rock want to roll down the hill? Did it decide to roll down the hill? No. Come on. We know that rocks don't have thoughts or feelings or desires. That's just something that happened. The rock happened to roll down the hill. But people, allegedly, are different. People decide to do things. What it means to do something is that there is some particular mental state that caused you to do it. Which mental state was it? Well, it is desire. You have a bunch of desires. I have a bunch of desires. There's all sorts of things I want to do. I want to go watch a movie. I want to go eat a piece of pizza. I want to smoke a cigarette. I want to drink 5 beers. There's a bunch of things I want to do. How come I'm not doing all those things all at once? Well, because that would be impossible. You can't do all the things that you want at once. Some of the things that you want are contradictory. You can only do them one at a time. I want to go skiing and I want to go swimming. But it wouldn't be fun to do both. It would be fun to do one at one time and one at the other time. It's very useful to have our different desires go up and down. Like I'm really hungry, but I'm really, really thirsty. I'm way more thirsty than I am hungry, so therefore I'm going to drink first, get a beverage. And I drink it, and once I drink enough, then my desire for drink goes down, and my desire for food is now higher than my desire. That's a great way to organize an animal, is to have different desires that go up and down, and they act on the ones that are the greatest desires. But whenever you act, it looks like your action is determined. Just by being a rational being, you are determined. Here's something slightly different. It's not psychological determinism, it's ethical determinism. And this is something that goes back to Socrates and Plato. And it's the idea that you always act according to what you think is good. So Socrates and Plato had this view that would seem to entail that no one knowingly does evil. Everybody that does evil are just people that have a mistaken view about what is good. So you might recall from our discussion of time travel that if you could go back in the past, probably you should kill Hitler as soon as you got there. Go back and kill baby Hitler because of the evil that he was going to bring into the world. Now, Socrates and Plato would say, now, think about what you're doing. Like, Hitler, he didn't knowingly do evil. He just had a really mistaken view about what was good. Hitler was trying to do good. And they might argue that everybody is trying to do good. Well, you might ask, well, how come there's so much evil in the world if everyone's trying to do good? And the answer is, well, people just, some of them at least, have mistaken views about what is good. Okay, so we have discussed 5 kinds of determinism. You have to know all 5. You got to know them. But if you were to choose just 2 to really concentrate on, you should concentrate on physical determinism. That's this one about everything being caused by some prior event. And psychological determinism. That's this one about human actions being caused by the greatest desire that human has at that time. This woman is going to eat a piece of pizza and not a banana. Why? Is it because she wanted the banana more? And to show her love for the banana, she didn't eat it? No. She ate the pizza because that's what she wanted more at that moment. And if she drops both the pizza and the banana and runs into a burning building to save a baby, that's because that's what she wanted more at that moment. The thing that she most wanted to do is the thing that she ends up doing, unless some outside force prevents her from doing it. As long as she is not being restrained or influenced by outside forces, then what she does is the thing that she most wanted to do at that moment in time. But that would seem to entail that her actions are predetermined. Okay, so we've got all these different kinds of determinism, but what I don't want to talk about now are the basic components of determinism. Regardless of what kind of determinism we're talking about, what is it that makes it determinism? And what is it that makes it also going to be a bit of a pain in the butt for free will? I want you to know that whenever we're talking about determinism, regardless of whether it's theological determinism or logical determinism or psychological determinism or ethical determinism or physical determinism, it's always going to have two parts. There's two ideas that go into the idea of determinism. One of them is the idea that every event is determined by some prior event. This is the idea number one, that often is referred to in connection with the word predetermination or predetermined. What's happening now is predetermined. Now, there's this second idea that is part of determinism, and it's as important as the first one. And it's the idea that for everything that happens, every event that happens, it had to happen. And another way of putting the statement that it had to happen is to say that it could not have been otherwise. What it means to say that some event, some moment in time was determined is to say that there was no alternative. It could not have been otherwise. You might say, that's crazy. There's all sorts of things that, like, it could have been otherwise. Like, right? Like, right now I'm wearing a gray shirt with sleeves, but I could have been wearing a pink tank top. Couldn't it have been otherwise? Well, if it was determined that on this day, November 1st, 2018, that I was going to wear a gray long sleeve shirt, then it is true that I could not have done otherwise. That's just what it means. So this idea that it could not have been otherwise is going to be very important in thinking about determinism. And you can see how this would relate to things about choices. When you think about free will, you often think about choices and the idea of having free choice. And what it means to have choices is to have options. Suppose I went into a restaurant and I ordered dessert, and I asked, what are my options? And they say, there is one option. Vanilla ice cream. Well, there's a sense in which there are zero options then. I just eat the vanilla ice cream. And you might say, well, you could kill yourself and not eat the vanilla ice cream. But no, imagine this. Imagine you just had to eat vanilla ice cream. How many options do you have? Well, obviously, you have zero options. What it means to have any options is to have at least two options. Like, for example, you eat the ice cream or you kill yourself. Or you eat the ice cream or you eat the piece of pizza. Or you eat the ice cream or you eat the piece of pizza. Or you eat a nice pretzel with chocolate on it. What it means to have options is to have multiple options. There's the thing that you do, and there's the thing that you could have done even though you didn't do it. Another phrase for referring to this is the idea of a non-actual possibility. Maybe there are multiple possibilities for what I'm going to do next. One possibility is that I raise my left hand. One possibility is that I raise my right hand. Another possibility is I raise both hands. Another possibility is I raise neither. Let's see what happens. I have raised my left hand. So what about those other possibilities? Well, those other possibilities are non-actual possibilities. I could have done them, but I actually didn't do them. But they were still possibilities. So the second part of determinism is to say that there are no other possibilities except for one, the one that is actual. Okay, regardless of whether we're talking about psychological determinism or theological determinism or physical determinism, there's always going to be these two parts. The idea, number one, of predetermination, and the idea, number two, of things having only one possible outcome, that they could not have done otherwise. I want to switch now and get into a cool area of philosophy known as neurophilosophy. This is the combination of neuroscience and philosophy, and if you know me, you know I've published books about this stuff. This is really cool and interesting to me, the ways in which the science of the brain interact with philosophy. And we're going to talk a little bit about some famous experiments that are supposed to show, and maybe they fail to show it, but they're supposed to show that free will is just an illusion. One of the most famous ones is the Libet experiment. The neuroscientist Benjamin Libet devised a psychological experiment in which experimental subjects were instructed to do something of their own free will, and the scientific experimenters were monitoring their brain activity to see what happened when. And the results are very interesting and puzzling, and one interpretation is that it shows that people don't actually have free will. They just feel like they have free will. So this is a 4-minute video that conveys the gist of the experiment. While you are watching the video, I'm going to smoke a pipe or drink a beverage or play guitar. I don't know. We'll see what happens. Maybe I have free will. Anyway, I'll check you out after the video. Enjoy.
We all have this very strong belief that we have conscious free will, and it's a central part of our idea of ourselves as individuals that we can want to do something, we can have an intention to do something, and then we can do it. We can make our intention drive our actions. And Benjamin Libet's work was one of the few experiments which made a truly innovative and courageous attempt to address that question.
I can't feel it being cold.
Patrick Haggard's team are going to measure my brain activity in the run-up to a conscious decision, with electrodes placed on my scalp.
Okay, Susan, hello. You're all wired up and ready to go.
Absolutely.
We're going to record from your left motor cortex, your right motor cortex, and from the midline. I want you to watch the clock hand, which is rotating in this small clock in the center of the screen. And then, at any time that you choose, when you intend and will to, I want you to press either this key or this key.
As the urge?
As the urge takes you.
Fine, okay.
And then the computer will prompt you to type in the position of the clock hand at which you first felt the conscious will to press the button.
Good.
Any questions?
No.
Off we go.
It's very funny waiting for the urge, isn't it?
So watching the clock, I record the exact time that I make the decision to act, while the electrodes on my head monitor the activity in my brain leading up to this decision. As I do this over and over again, a clear pattern starts to emerge.
So here are our results, which contain the same basic effect as Libet originally found. The average time of the intention to move was where this arrow is here, and you can see that the motor areas of the brain have begun to build up electrical activity in preparation for this willed action 2,000 milliseconds at least before the action actually occurs.
Just as in Libet's original work, this experiment seems to show that my brain begins to prepare for movement long before I felt like I had consciously decided to move. So did I have any real choice about when I moved? Could the feeling of having made a decision just be an illusion?
So this looks like a real problem for our idea of conscious free will, because our assumption that we work with every day, I think, is that we decide what we want to do, and then, or I should say, I decide what I want to do, and then I am able to get my brain to drive my body to make it happen.
Okay, welcome back. I didn't play guitar or drink a beverage or smoke a pipe. So there you go. Are you surprised? Let's talk a little bit more about the Libet experiment. You've seen the video now. Hopefully you get a feel for it, about what's going on. If you want to watch the video again, I suppose you could. Or I can just talk you through it. There's some components to the experiment that are worth thinking about. And one way of thinking about them that might be useful for you is to think about what is objectively available to the experimental, to the scientists, and what is subjectively available just to the subject. So here's the experimental subject, and I want you to imagine that you are the scientist looking at the subject. So from the outside, you can monitor the brain of the subject. You can also monitor the rest of their body. You can monitor the muscles in their hand. And we've got a EEG machine hooked up to their brain, an electroencephalograph hooked up to the brain. We've got an EMG hooked up to the muscles in their wrist. There's all sorts of objective information we know about what electrical activity is happening in what part of the body at what time. So, additionally, scientists know things like how long does it take a nerve impulse to travel from, say, this part of the body to this part of the body. There's a lot of very solid information about that. And by the way, it's surprisingly slow. You might think of like your reflexes as being very fast, like you could do things really rapidly, and the information must be shooting around your body at rapid speeds, like the speed of light or the speed of electricity. But no, actually, the time it takes for nerve signals to get from, say, your shoulder to your wrist, or just from your brain, one part of your brain to the other part of your brain, the speed at which those are traveling it's about the same as an ox cart or a donkey-drawn carriage. It's actually quite small, but since you are small, you can get by with having a relatively slow signal moving from your foot to your brain. Anyway, scientists know, for example, if the wrist moved at such and such time, they know when the brain event that caused it must have happened, because they know how long it takes for something from the brain, some signal in the brain, to make it all the way down to the wrist. Okay, so they're monitoring when the wrist flick occurred. The subject was told, whenever you want, use your free will to flick your wrist, and the scientists know when the wrist got flicked. The scientists also know when there's this brain event, which happens in statistical correlation with the wrist flick. This is something that they refer to as the readiness potential. It's this electrical event in the brain that if you're looking from like the outside, what is the thing in the brain that most directly corresponds to the wrist being flicked? It's this thing called the readiness potential. So they know when the wrist got flicked. They know when the readiness potential happened. Now here's a question. How do you bring free will into this, or even the feeling of will? Well, now we're talking about something subjective, so we have to ask the subject. We ask the subject to pay attention to this clock and to try to make mental note of where the dot was on the clock when they decided to flick their wrist. And then tell us what that time was. And so they could tell us, and they say it was like 3:15 and 7 seconds. So now we know what their subjective impression is of when their free will decision got made. And we compare that time, the subjective time where they felt like they had their free will acting, with the objective time of when the readiness potential happened. And here's the cool thing. The readiness potential actually happened first. The readiness potential happened before the time that the subject claims their free will happened. Assuming that the subject is right, that is when their free will appearance happened, then it would seem that the free will appearance isn't doing anything. The free will appearance isn't making the wrist move. The free will appearance happens after the readiness potential. So that makes it look like free will is just an illusion. It's just this illusion, this feeling that's along for the ride, this not making anything happen. Now, you might say, this is a weird experiment. It's hard to understand. It's hard to interpret. Even if you're a scientist, you might say, I'm not sure this really disproves free will. But there are other scientific experiments, way more than just this one or the next one that we're going to talk about, that really indicate that there's something problematic about this idea of free will. And I'll just talk about it, one more, because it's not a science class anyway, it's a philosophy class. Sometimes science is relevant for philosophy, and that's why we're talking about this stuff. But anyways, there's this experiment conducted by the researchers Nisbett and Wilson that we will refer to as the Pantyhose experiment. In this experiment, experimental subjects were brought into a shopping scenario in which they were presented with multiple stacks of pantyhose, and they were instructed to choose the ones that they wanted and purchase those. They were given some money to purchase pantyhose. I guess they selected people that wanted pantyhose or needed pantyhose. Anyway, they had a bunch of subjects go and look at a bunch of pantyhose arranged in stacks at in a store display. And then after they purchased the pantyhose, they were given a survey or asked some questions about why they selected the pantyhose that they did. And they would answer, they would give detailed answers like, I purchased the ones that were softer, or they had a deeper color, or I could tell that the material was stronger. And you might say, yeah, right. I've never bought pantyhose, but probably that's how I would do it. What's interesting here? What does this say about free will? Well, let me tell you, the twist. Here's the twist. All of the pantyhose in the experiment were exactly the same. The scientists made sure that all the different piles of pantyhose were exactly the same color and made of exactly the same material with exactly the same strength and exactly the same texture. The only thing that really predicted which pantyhose the people bought was that if the people were right-handed, they would tend to favor the pantyhose that was on the right hand of the display. But no one said that's why they bought the pantyhose. They all said these things that it turns out is objectively false. They didn't buy the pantyhose on the right because the pantyhose had a stronger material. Objectively, that's false that it had a stronger material. They didn't buy the pantyhose on the right because it had a deeper color. It's objectively false that it had a deeper color. Now you might say, well, maybe it subjectively seemed to them to have the deeper color, or it subjectively seemed to them to have a stronger material. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that they just made up bullshit after the fact, that free will is just along for the ride. They made up a story after they made their choice. They made up a story that's false for why they made that choice. And if that's really what's happening, then like in the Libet experiment, the will isn't actually doing anything. What's doing stuff is stuff that's happening unconsciously. That's happening before the so-called will. The will is just some little thing that happens afterwards that makes you feel good about yourself. But really, it's not the main character in the story. Study questions. Study question 1. The point of the story about the two drivers is to illustrate A, the idea that every event is determined by some prior event, B, the proposition that for every event that happens, it had to happen and could not have been otherwise, C, the empirical finding that your brain makes your hand move before you have a conscious awareness of deciding to move your hand, D, the proposition that you always act to satisfy your greatest desire, E, the importance of the concept of free will for the concept of moral responsibility. Which one is it? Study question 2. You always act according to your greatest desire. Huh? I think I wrote this question wrong. You always act according to your greatest desire. We'll come back to study question 2. Sorry about that. Study question 3. Which of the following is a basic component of all forms of determinism? A, every event is determined by some prior event. B, you always act according to your greatest desire. C, for every event that happens, it had to happen, and it could not have been otherwise. D, both B and C. E, both A and C. Which of the following is a basic component of all forms of determinism? Well, you might remember that I said there's 2 basic components of all forms of determinism, so that would seem to indicate that perhaps the answer is either D or E. Is it D, both B and C, or is it E, both A and C? Well, let's look at what we got here. Every event is determined by some prior event. You always act according to your greatest desire. C, for every event that happens, it had to happen. It could not have been otherwise. Well, some of you might have noticed that B, you always act according to your greatest desire. That's not part of all forms of determinism. That's just an expression of psychological determinism. But A and C are actually parts of all forms of determinism. So the correct answer is E, both A and C. And that's what this says here. 3, the answer is E. How about study question 1? The answer is supposed to also be E. The point of the story about the two drivers is to illustrate E, the importance of the concept of free will for the concept of moral responsibility. Okay, what's going on with question number 2, that weird one? The answer is supposed to be D. Who says the answer is supposed to be D? I say the answer is supposed to be D because I write these questions. So let me make sure I write them correctly. The answer is D. So let's go back to question number 2. The answer is D, psychological determinism. You always act according to your greatest desire. Let's just delete the rest of this. Boom. You always act according to your greatest desire. What is that? Is it theological determinism, physical determinism, ethical determinism, psychological determinism, or logical determinism? If you've been paying attention, you know that the answer is D. You always act according to your greatest desire. That's psychological determinism. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the determinism lecture. Until next time, be free.